April 10th, 1858, drew a salt-soft damp across Savannah, so even brick seemed to breathe. Fog laced Bay Street's warehouses in long, pale skeins, and the river's broad back kept its own counsel beneath the masts. In the mansion's back kitchen, where heat lives year-round, Lydia stood between hearth and table and turned a pewter ladle in her palm, weighing not broth, but a rule. The metal's cool curve steadied her pulse the way a straight edge steadies a stubborn seam. Above the wharf, the cathedral bell dropped iron beads into the air one by one. Each landed on her ribs before it reached her ear, setting the hour upright without asking permission. White dinner napkins waited stacked on the sideboard, their folds crisp as unsmiling mouths. Starch had taught them posture, but cloth remembers service no matter how it is dressed. Behind the pantry wall, the house ledgers breathed their paste-sweet breath through the crack and made a paper rustle like creatures confident of their own power. Near the yard, the courtyard gate rehearsed itself. Bar certain it was law, Hinge puffed with habit, and the latch, too clever by half, tried to be heard for its own sake. The kitchen light threw a low honey across flagstones stained by years of drips and steps. Onion and bay leaf traveled the room in a modest procession, joined by the iron tang that fires release when they are kept honest. She lifted the ladle bowl to the lamp and turned it until its shine paused and then quieted. A tool that refuses glare keeps its dignity for work. The haft warmed to her skin the way a name warms in the mouth when spoken rightly. Beyond the scullery door, glassware in the parlor rehearsed laughter. Here, the kettle's lid lifted and settled like a patient chest. A clock upstairs softened its tick to please carpets. Downstairs, the same minutes laid themselves plain along wood and bone. Lydia set the ladle down with the care given to a hymn book between songs and tested the pantry latch with 2 fingers. The tongue preened, the keeper sulked, and both learned to mind themselves under a muslin strip as narrow as a vow. She had learned to read a room the way a seamstress reads cloth, where the weave runs true, where a hidden knot waits to pucker the line, where a forgiving bias might be turned to grace. The ledgers behind the plank door imagined themselves as judgment. She knew them for what they were. Plant made proud by ink. The napkins, white as Sunday voices, pretended they could absolve what they covered. She knew whiteness does its best work shading bread on a board or drying a child's hair. The gate wanted to speak law. She intended to teach it courtesy. Lift, set, no brag. Names took their places beneath her breastbone as if pews had been set out there. Ruth first, then the elders whose backs keep roofs tight and tempers cooler, then the small ones who already can tell which door listens and which door performs. She did not spend those names aloud. Breath keeps, that liturgy straighter than speech. The bell laid another bead upon the port. The river answered with a low metal note of its own from some far mooring. Lydia touched the pantry door once, as one might touch a forehead to test for fever, and let her hand fall with its lesson given. What was priced and signed will be answered by proportion and breath, she said into the warm air, not for witness, but for work. No noise, no show. The pewter lay where she'd set it, exact and untroubled. The latch, chastened, held its peace. The napkins kept their foolish dignity until called to better use. She wiped her palms, took the hour into her shoulders like a well-cut shawl, and lifted her eyes to the fog-bright window where night's damp pressed its cool blessing. Before the story goes on, please tell us from where you are watching this story and what time when this story reaches you. Night glazed the drawing room in brandy light, the cut glass trembling with tame stars while a violin wrote quick loops over a carpet that never knew a coal stain. White cloth ran the sideboard like a river made to behave, shells of meringue and sugared peel pretending plenty had a halo. Behind it, a clock softened its tick to suit conversation. Down the corridor, the scullery kept a square of honest heat, where damp oak breathed, and the same cathedral bell that arrived velvet in the parlor touched the ribs here with clean taps that asked for work and gave measure in return. Out in the yard, the rope between posts sagged under mitts, giving up steam to the April chill, and the pump wore a cold sheen where a hand must brave it without ceremony. The servants' gate, once fond of brag, remembered to rise and settle without applause. The hinge yielded like a shoulder taught to mind itself. Lydia crossed the seam between these weathers, perfume on her left, lie on her right, and read the house as a garment turned inside out, seams where pride hid its thread, a hem dragging where attention thinned, a hidden tuck that would pucker under strain. In the kitchen, aprons white as frost did not argue innocence. They kept bread from air and sleeves from grease and called it enough. A gust pressed fog against the yard bricks and left them darker, as if the night had knelt to wash its face. Lydia listened to how doors behaved when they thought no one watched. A latch in the side hall tried a compliment on itself. The pantry mouth, newly corrected, chose good manners over chatter. She moved without wasting sound, hands passing from knife haft to crock lid to iron ring, tuning a small republic into steadiness. The house kept 2 calendars under one roof, one that borrowed midnight for games, another that counted minutes like coins, and the bell carried both without favor. She paused at the threshold and let the differences arrange themselves, not as grievance, but as a map. The ledgers behind the pantry door consorted with paste and pretense, yet even their breath spoke, plant if warmed into humility. The white on the table upstairs borrowed virtue, while the cloth in her hands labored for it. Lydia set the pewter ladle where the lamp would not flatter it, adjusted a hinge with 2 fingers as if settling a child's cap, and took the hour into her shoulders like a shawl that asked to be used, not admired. Spring light had softened the counting room until rice dust looked like gilt along the ledger edges, paste lending the air a faint sweetness that pretended to be permanence. Lydia stood with her cap straight and her hands free of flour, speaking the kind of promise that labor can make without lying. Dawn bread turned out even, sauces kept to silk without boast. Sabbath hems mended in quiet. In return, no florid bargain, only a simple boundary. Ruth's name not to be written into any book that traveled with the river. The mistress smiled with teeth, the steward's nod mimed law, and the pastor, fetched like a ribbon, let a breath pass and called that witness. A pen made a careful mark, as if a mark could stand watch. The house behaved for a little while as though agreement had weight. Bells laid their noon and eve with impartial hands. Receipts folded in obedient quarters. Lydia's loaves rose to their proof, as if they too had heard the clause and approved. Then market day swelled and choked Bay Street with carts. Men put cedar to their tongues and sharpened figures until the shavings looked like virtue. At the river, a manifest took on pages like a snake after rain. Tags found wrists and sleeves. A clerk spat grit from between his teeth and called it diligence. The water shouldered wharf and boat alike without praise or anger, and the fog took all their breath into itself without becoming theirs. Lantern hour brought the message as if the night itself had been instructed to speak. A boy too young for midnight errands carried a folded slip, and eyes he did not yet know how to hide. The steward's mouth shaped, adjusted, a word thin enough to pass as harmless while it dragged a life behind it. Fever did the last distance the way a knife does its line, quick and without ornament. Lydia did not drop pan or spoon. The hand that knows weight keeps its habit even when struck. She climbed the back stair because the front one performs, and on the landing at the turn lay a glove, white as a claim, creased where someone had taught it pride. Powder clung to its wrist. Scent that would please a drawing-room hovered over leather that had never been asked to lift anything heavier than itself. She lifted it between 2 fingers as if testing a thread for soundness, and found it told her only about ease. White, she understood, need not be emblem. It could be service if asked rightly. For now, it was witness, an object that believed it could bless harm by proximity. She set it on the rail where the owner would find it and be made to look at their own hand, missing a prop. Back in the kitchen, the ladle lay where she had left it, the pewter cool with patience. The pantry latch accepted her touch without vanity. Lydia pressed knuckles to the table scar where a pot had once made its case, and let the bell lay its next bead across her. She did not say Ruth's name into the room. She hung it behind the breastbone where breath keeps its promises truer than a mouth. The ledgers behind the plank door shuffled themselves and believed that motion to be justice. The gate gave a self-important click and was steadied. The window took a small fog and kept it. Her vow made no light and raised no voice. It drew a line instead, the neat kind a seamstress lays where fabric must hold, proportion against excess, breath against thunder, exact consequence against swagger. The house continued in its separate weathers, and she, with pewter in hand and names seated within, turned toward the work that would bring them briefly to the same climate and teach each hinge, latch, cloth, and book the manner it had forgotten. Night narrowed itself along the buttery's brick, the lamp's small flame laying a steady coin of light across handles, rubbed honest by years of service. Lydia set the pewter ladle over her palm as one tests a measure for truth, turning it until shine ceased to boast and simply bore weight. The curve cooled her skin and taught the pulse a calmer cadence. Beside it, she placed the kitchen hatchet, no swagger in its square head, rolling its eye in her grasp until iron and bone agreed on center. A narrow slip sheared from a spent ledger weighted by her thumb, ready to hush a tin's loose mouth, while a muslin strip, pared thin and folded patient, promised to teach an unruly latch the better manners of quiet. At the pantry sill she knelt, cheek tasting the stone's mild chill, and found with her fingertips the clean, persistent breath that walked beneath the boards, a draught that favored work if given a road. She settled the muslin where tongue and keeper trade pride for clamor, not binding, only cushioning, and stroked the latch once so metal would remember decency without show. The jealous hinge on the courtyard door, long indulged in its own opinions, met her warmed thumb and a whisper of tallow. She raised the door a hair and set it down twice, as a seamstress smooths a pucker, until iron consented to turn like a good servant instead of a herald. Under the marble sideboard, her palm found a pocket of kept cool, a cellared hush gathering where stone refused the room's appetite. She marked it with a quiet nod as a savor of temper to be called upon when cloth above would pretend innocence. Back at the table, she balanced the hatchet's pole across a single knuckle and waited for stillness to choose her hand. When it settled, the tool became ballast against any thought that might tilt toward drama. The ladle she rested bowl down, a modest weight upon the table's scar, not a threat, but a plumb to keep lines straight. She ran the ledger sliver along a tin's lip until seam met seam like kin and the lid learned to seat itself without gossip. Names gathered, not as blaze but as the banked red that warms a long night. Ruth foremost, then elder backs that keep roofs true, then the small ones who can tell the difference between a door that listens and a door that performs. She did not spend them in air, but let breath carry their order inward, where vows keep better. From the lane, harbor bells stitched lean notes through fog. The same strokes landed softer upstairs, yet here they set bone to even marching. Lydia turned the lamp's wick down to a humbler ring and listened as the room adopted its new grammar. Latch consenting to courtesy, hinge to service, draft to obedience. No object needed to be told twice. She slid the muslin and ledger slip into the biscuit tin beneath the flour bin, tucked under a board taught to keep counsel, then drew the buttery door until it kissed its frame without a word. When she stepped into the corridor, the house felt trued by small degrees, tools repurposed from spectacle to rule, air taught to walk in measure. And she carried that measure forward, a quiet law set in her ribs for the work yet to be asked. The mistress's desk kept its polish like a mask, paste and calfskin mingling into a fragrance that pretended to be permanence. Columns preened under a green shade, as if posture could pass for truth. Lydia stood just inside the doorway, where wood keeps a night's cool, and read the room as one reads a sky before weather. Corners hoarding shadow, the baseboard's slow current, the way the quills shine flattered a hand unused to ash or steam. Lesson 1 wrote itself with the patience of steam over cloth. Temper the air, and paper remembers it was plant. Give warmth without blaze, and figures bow to sense rather than to show. On the chapel stair, wax breathed faintly from the rail where 100 palms had worn varnish to a soft honesty. Rise and run held an older doctrine, a modest difference on the third tread that corrected pride without bruise, asking breath to match step before sentence. Lydia set her thumb to that balded place and felt geometry speak a quieter authority than any sermon. Lesson 2 found bone and settled there. Put voice under angle, and height will learn its duty to lungs. In the courtyard, the gate's iron tongue had long mistaken racket for law. The bar, fond of announcing itself, tried a clap to hear its echo. She measured plate and keeper with her eye, saw where cloth would best teach metal to be useful instead of vain, and noted the nail-head that would catch a careless ring of keys as surely as a story catches a braggart. Lesson 3 moved into her hands. Doors are hired for passage, not performance. School the hinge in smaller music, and the room behind will recover its dignity. Toward the dining hall, the Easter board practiced innocence under its white, crystal multiplying faces until appetite looked like ceremony. Beneath the trestle remembered weight, and the old cool understone kept a quiet harvest. Near the shutter she'd tied to, nearly, a disciplined breath had begun to walk the wall as instructed. Lydia pressed the heel of her hand to the table's underside and felt the banked chill waiting to be wed to that measured draught. Lesson 4 arrived clean and stern. Call linen to witness from below, and what mouths refuse will write itself into cloth without scorch. She threaded these precincts with the economy of a cook moving between hearth and oven, desk to stair, gate to board, each set in her keeping by a countersign that cost no noise. For ledgers, tempered air; for sermons, the schooling of steps; for gates, the courtesy of quiet; for white spreads, truth carried underneath their glow. A harbor bell counted an even beat through all rooms alike, and the house's many clocks tried, each in its way, to borrow that fairness. Lydia let the pewter ladle ride her palm like a level, the hatchet's weight steady at her side like character, and stored the 4 lessons where breath keeps faith. When she turned back toward the kitchen, fog pressed its cool face to the window, as if to say the night would remember what had been taught. Night drew its cord tight across the yard, the pump iron beating a faint moisture that kissed and stung the hand in the same instant. Lydia moved in measured spans, kitchen to pantry, pantry to yard, yard to chapel wall, letting breath, not haste, count the distance. At the ledgered sill she set a chalk fleck, no higher than her palm, where the cold slipped through like a cautious thought. The courtyard hinge, lately bossy, accepted the warmth from her thumb and a whisper of tallow, then lifted and settled without vanity. The latch took a muslin lesson and forgot to preen. Beneath the flour bin, the biscuit tin learned discretion, a ledger sliver trued along its lip, and a pared strip of cloth folded small, both nested under a plank that kept counsel better than most men. At the shutter she tied it to nearly no more than a coin's mercy, so the night's breath would choose obedience over spectacle and walk the wall as if on an errand. In the dining room she turned a goblet mouth down, where a careless thirst would reach first, setting water ahead of liquor with the quiet authority of an old rule. Doors, locks, and hinges along the service hall practiced their smaller music as she passed. A tongue meeting its keeper, and sitting. A bar lifting and setting without applause. A key consenting to turn only as far as duty requires. The pewter ladle rode her forearm, not as threat, but as level. A plain weight against the tug of grievance. The kitchen hatchet hung at her apron band like ballast, squaring any thought that tried to tilt toward show. Names made their procession under the breastbone, Ruth foremost, then the elder backs that kept Ruth steady in storm season, then the small ones already fluent in which door listens and which doctor performs, and she let them keep order by breath alone. Harbor chimes stitched their lean metal through fog, and the cathedral bell answered in iron coins. She took those measures into her ribs until pulse and hour agreed. Back at the hearth, she turned the lamp wick to a modest ring and waited while the room spoke its corrected grammar. Draft walking where invited, Hinge preferring service, Latch content to do its work without chatter. When she stepped into the yard once more, the bricks wore a damp shine like a well-scrubbed face, and the night fitted over her shoulders with the precision of cloth cut by a careful hand. Stars thinned to pins above the brick yard, their light clean as a needle's eye, while the pump breathed a faint metal cool that tasted of iron and river alike. Lydia sat on the low step where stone remembers knees and set the pewter ladle bowl down upon her lap as a little anchor against wandering. The kitchen hatchet's back met her wrist until the pulse conceded to the bell's fairness. Harbor chimes and the cathedral's strict count braided the air, one weathered, one exact, each bead falling where the ribs could keep it. Beyond the wall, a cart late to its stall sketched a tired line, and then the lane learned to hold its tongue. She rose and read the kitchen by touch. The table's mended foot, a new peg sanded to truth, took weight without complaint. The shutter tied to nearly exhaled its taut breath along the plaster in a steady, dutiful seam. The pantry latch, corrected earlier, accepted 2 fingers and sat without a syllable. Where the marble sideboard met the wainscot, her palm found the stored hush that stone keeps for lean hours. Where the corridor turned, a nail-head stood just proud enough to ask keys to wait their arrogance. She traced each with skin and knuckle, as a seamstress traces basted lines before setting the final stitch, then returned to the step and let her breath settle into the frame she had chosen. From the bodice she drew a folded scrap softened by keeping and set it beneath the sternum, pressing paper to bone until it borrowed her cadence. Names spoke without sound, Ruth, then the elder shoulders that lift and lower without witness, then the small ones who know that a hinge tells the truth of a house, and she asked them not for blaze, but for ballast. The ladle's edge caught a breath of lamp and refused to shine. The hatchet's wooden haft wore the warmth of her hand, as if it had been made to bear it. Somewhere, a clock upstairs softened its tick for carpets. Out here, time walked on brick and kept its dignity. She stood once more, walked the pantry threshold, and laid 2 fingers under the bar, so the door would know itself as passage and nothing more. Along the service hall, a draft moved as trained, and linen in a basket, white without boasting, waited to shoulder bread rather than preen. Lydia let her thumb rest on the balded curve of the chapel rail, where angle corrects. Speech felt the oak return a tempered courage, and withdrew before any heel announced itself. The bell climbed toward its iron crest. With each stroke the city's borrowed ornaments fell away, leaving measure and need in their clearest forms. When the last minute before midnight stood up in the room and asked to be recognized, she answered it by turning the lamp a breath lower, and setting the ladle back upon the scar where past labor had left its ring. The muslin in her pocket lay folded as a modest promise. The ledger sliver waited to make a seam behave. Lydia stepped into the corridor she had taught to mind itself, the floor learning her foot and not the other way around, and carried the names where breath keeps faith. Forward, not to summon thunder, but to arrive in measure at the place where cloth, metal, air, and will agree upon one work. 11 o'clock rested like thin varnish upon the pane, and the mistress's room held its meek lamp under a green shade, breathing paste and calfskin as if dignity were a scent one could apply. Ledgers stood in a proud row upon the shelf, spines heartened by polish. A porcelain stand nursed quills that gleamed like small bones. The seal press kept its iron mouth shut, pleased with its own restraint. Night pressed a cool thread along the baseboard where a draught knew its road. The door's edge, drawn to near and not to shut, allowed air to move as an honest guest. Lydia entered with steps sized to boards, the pewter ladle a calm weight at her side, the kitchen hatchet quiet as ballast in the small of her back. She knelt by the grate where embers held a thought without ambition. From her apron she brought the wick she had trimmed to humility at dusk, no rope, only a strand, and set it within the hearth's lee where breath begins its journey. She did not command flame, she courted temper. The door remained to a coin's mercy, the room learned to sip. Heat walked the baseboard like a careful reader looking for sense instead of show, and the cold, being well-mannered, stepped aside by degrees. On the desk, the open book softened at its corners. Leather ceased to posture and remembered bark and rain. Paper noticed first. The marker ribbon slackened a fraction, like a neckcloth conceding the weather. The paste released a plant-sweet note that carried a field's faint memory. Ink at the nib delayed its descent the space of a heartbeat, then flowed with less vanity. The mistress, intent on columns that liked to parade, licked a pencil and frowned when a figure blotted under her haste. "Mind that draught," she said to the furniture, and turned the wick down to a gentler ring, proud to think the improvement hers. Lydia squared the ledger with her palm the way a seamstress squares a hem. No flourish, only the return of right angle to a thing built for it. On the sill, where she had laid a chalk fleck at the leak, the new temper of air made a modest correction. The sill kept counsel, the curtain declined to shiver. The seal press lifted a glimmer under the lamp, and yet stayed uninvited. The sand in its shaker waited to prettify nothing. Lydia placed the ladle's bowl, inverted at the desk's edge, no signal, simply a plum for breath, and watched as figures, warmed past stiffness, shed their strut and took their proper size. The mistress tried again. Numbers no longer saluted her wish, but walked at the pace of truth, and her jaw learned to be reasonable. The cathedral bell laid a single iron bead upon the shelf backs, and traveled from wood into bone, without asking leave. The mistress's hand drifted to the latch, felt the door's modest posture, and, without knowing why, let it remain. Lydia tested the wick with a thumb's shadow, and found its lesson steady. Warmth to humble, not to scorch. The book breathed, spine easing into its hinge, plant remembering itself after a season spent pretending decree. Beyond, the city exhaled fog into the squares. Here, the sanctum accepted measure and became less theater, more room. She closed the pewter under her palm like a benediction, lifted the hatchet an inch to reseat its quiet, and withdrew to the jamb until the space held its corrected breath without her hand upon it. Nothing smoked, nothing cried, only posture lowered by a hair, and the sum turned honest by that smallest act. Lydia stepped back into the corridor's stone cool, left the door neither open nor closed, and let the numbers finish their bow to temper while the bell counted the hour cleanly across plaster and rib alike. 5 minutes shy of midnight, the back corridor wore a pale sift of flour the way dawn wears mist, each step writing and then erasing itself without complaint. A nail lantern threw a steady circle the size of a basin. Bagged sugar cast low hills. The air moved with purpose from the tide to nearly shutter toward the undersill, keeping to the road it had been taught. A young maid in a borrowed shawl stood stiff with a tray of broth and cups, her knuckles whitening, her breath unsure whether to stay or go. At the side door, a deputy rehearsed authority in the jingle at his hip, keys chattering like small coins spent for noise. Lydia came with the corridor's grammar in her stride. She put 2 fingers to the latch that had loved applause and felt the old vanity still in it, like a habit looking for a stage. From her apron she drew the muslin folded thin as patience and slid it between tongue and keeper, so metal would accept courtesy over clamor. Her other hand found the bar, lifted, and settled it, the width a good rule allows, no more, and the panel moved without boasting. The hinge, lately tutored from pride to service, turned with a sound no louder than a breath taken by a careful singer. "Go on," Lydia said, voice fitted to the lantern circle, and the girl stepped through the obedient opening, tray steady as a horizon. Beyond it, the draught she had disciplined received the broth's salt without turning. It to spectacle and harm, having scheduled itself to noise, arrived to find silence keeping house. The deputy lunged late. His keys met the proud nail-head Lydia had memorized and improvised a pause. The jingle broke in his hand like a speech that has lost its point. "Back," he breathed, discovering there was nowhere grand enough for his word to stand. The room recorded the truth in modest senses. Lamp oil held its truce with flame. The broth passed, steam thinning to decency. Flour lifted and settled like tired bees. Lydia withdrew the cloth, refolded it along the same seam as a letter kept for later, and touched the latch once. It seated without clap. The door learned its size again, passage, not pronouncement, and the corridor remembered itself as a place meant for work, not theater. The girl's shawl brushed the heel of air and was gone around the bend, her step absorbed by the house's corrected hush. Lydia laid her palm flat on the panel briefly, a thanks given for good office, then let her hand fall to the pewter's cool and the hatchet's steadying weight. The deputy rescued his keys and found himself surplus to the scene. Vanity, checked, made a small retreat in his shoulders. Far down the service hall, linen rustled the honest sound of labor. Up the stair, wax breathed lightly from a rail where geometry keeps men from speaking larger than their lungs. The bell out beyond laid its last stone toward midnight, and each syllable found timber and tendon alike, without preference. She took the corner the girl had taken, not to follow, but to carry the measure forward. The corridor went with her, wood answering foot, with the civility of things restored to purpose. Ahead the chapel steps waited with their calm instruction, and clean air, under a white spread, held still beneath a table that believed itself innocent. Lydia's pocket carried muslin and paper, her ribs carried names, and the night, now trained, carried her into the next room without needing to be told twice. Midnight settled as a thin glaze on the chapel stair, whale oil lamps trimming the rail with a meek honey, while the harbor's damp leaned through mortar with a salt whisper. From the yard came a last scrap of laughter pared down to manners. From within the nave, wax and whisper breathed a cooler seam of air that traveled the corridor like a sober thought. Where those two weathers met at the turn, the steps made a quiet warning any heel might read if pride would listen. The cathedral bell laid one iron bead into timber and tendon alike, impartial as weather and exact as a ledger kept by a just hand. Lydia waited one riser below the bend, thumb resting on the rail's bald place, where varnish had long ago given up its pretense and let oak tell the truth. She knew this flight's grammar by bone, first lift welcoming, second advising care, third holding a small decisive difference that corrects height without bruise. The pewter ladle rode her palm like a level, not for striking but for measure. The kitchen hatchets, haft at her waist, carried the steadiness of ballast, not the appetite of blow. She placed her breath to the bell's count, and let the house's softer clocks fall away. The nave door parted to a careful crescent, and gave out a wash of candle and linen. The minister stepped into his own phrases, cup beneath white cloth as though emblem could outpace duty. Heel found tread with a habit of authority. Geometry, patient and without malice, replied. On the modest difference his shoulders revised themselves by instinct. A hand reached for the rail not to display humility, but to preserve the cup's quiet, and voice, meeting the stair's law, trimmed itself to a key human lungs can carry. No clatter, no chastisement, only the writing that comes when space and time refuse to flatter. "As we are fit," he began, then discovered breath's boundary and turned the sentence to plainer size. The cloth over the chalice forgot pageant and remembered service, shading metal without asserting virtue. Lydia's thumb blessed the rail's bare curve once, gratitude given to wood that holds a community upright, with nothing but angle and patience. From the hall beyond, a latch, recently taught, chose to seat without cough, and air moved through the arch as if invited rather than compelled. She let the minister pass into the corridor, where doors, corrected by small mercies, opened and closed like decent hands. Tongue-meeting keeper, Hinge preferring duty over remark. In the stair's hush she felt names gather within, Ruth foremost, then elder backs that outlast storm and gossip, then the small ones who know the temper of thresholds, and she kept them as ballast rather than flare. The bell set another beat upon the hour. The wood took it and sent it through the banister like a low amen. Lydia stood until rise and run returned fully to silence, the stair relinquishing its lesson without need of witness. She turned from wax and oak toward canvas and crystal, where a long white spread pretended innocence and would soon be asked to carry truer testimony from beneath. The ladle rested, the hatchet steadied, and her step took the corridor's taut civility toward the Easter board, geometry's correction tucked inside her breath, like a firm but gentle answer. Canvas held a winter brightness above the Easter board, lantern rings drifting up seams, while the river's damp pressed its cool palm against the panes and stayed its hand. White cloth went the length of the mahogany like a tamed current, starch lifting its chin as if innocence could be ironed on. Crystal repeated faces until appetite looked like ceremony, and silver lay with its reflections, trained to say yes. The scales at the end wore a sash of respectability, and the ledger at the steward's elbow pretended to bless the pounds it recorded. Outside, the harbor answered the cathedral's 12th stone with a smaller metal consent. Inside, chairs murmured and were still. Lydia came by the lee of chair legs where shadows kept their own counsel, and let her palm search the undercountry of the board. The trestle stored a cellar's calm. The marble sideboard held its patient cool like a jug's unspent sip. From the tide to nearly shudder, the trained breath walked the wall without flourish, obedient as a hired man with no taste for parade. She set the paired wick in the seam where plank met apron, no larger than a thought, and warmed a pinch of lint between finger and thumb until it remembered moderation. She shaved a lamp of hair, tilting attention toward the ceiling's soft brightness, while the work below took its seat. Above the cloth, laughter rehearsed its better nature. Below, truth set its hand. The draft married the board's stored hush, and together they wrote a sentence the linen could not refuse. No scorch rose, no smoke told tales, yet the weave deepened by the faintest shade, as if the fabric had learned a word and would keep it. A hand reached for ladle by habit, and, finding the inverted goblet Lydia had placed where thoughtless thirst goes first, let water answer before punch. Crystal, surprised, trembled, and then settled. Its multiplied faces returned to human. At the steward's elbow, the ledger corners relaxed the width of a fingernail. Paste breathed a field's memory, humble as stalks after rain. The scale's beam, fond of posture, discovered duty. Its pointer sat without smirk. A guest turned a jest loose and watched it fall short of the cloth, unoffended to find the room no longer willing to carry it. The sash of white at the end quit pretending to absolve, and linen pressed into better service from beneath, bore witness without requiring eyes. Lydia's fingers tested her small arrangement. The breath kept to its road, the wick held its temper, the lint refused vanity. She moved a napkin fold a thumb's width, no flourish, only the return of right angle to a corner meant for it, and heard the table accept the correction like a long word set back into its line. She did not look to the bowl that gathered faces. She let it learn modesty on its own. The hatchet's weight at her waist squared her thought when pride tried to rise. The pewter under her palm damped hunger for theater. Names gathered as ballast, not blaze. Ruth and the elders and the small ones, steadying her breath so the room's drift would not sway it. Midnight's last iron visited the rafters and went down through cloth and plank into bone. The board took it, and appetite, recognizing measure, changed its pace. A steward who loved symmetry paused and allowed a small imperfection to stand, because it told the truth more cleanly than polish could. The mistress felt her collar asked to be reasonable, and, without knowing why, obeyed. In a corner the ledger's ink hesitated, then settled with less swagger. At the head the white napkin ceased to posture and shaded a plate the way a cloud shades a field without needing a witness. Lydia withdrew by the seam of chairs she had used for entry, pockets lighter by a breath, heavier by intention completed. Canvas held its light like a vow paid and put away. The harbor gave one last metal syllable to the square. She stepped into the corridor she had taught to mind itself and let the room keep its quiet amendment. Ahead, the yard waited with iron and water to answer the pewter's warmth. Behind, a cloth, corrected from beneath, kept its new learning without complaint. Predawn limned the yard's brick with a pearl-gray skin, and the pump's iron handle wore a fine wet that kissed and pricked the palm in the same breath. Lydia set the biscuit tin upon the trough's lip, lowered the bucket, and heard the rope speak its braided syllable against wood, a sober sound that never asks to be praised. When she tipped the dipper, water laid itself over pewter in one unbroken sheet. The metal answered with a quiet that told of heat released without quarrel, a consent earned by measure rather than forced by show. The lid taught by a ledger sliver to meet its lip in good faith, seated without a syllable. What had been an instrument of carrying now served as level and law. She walked the kitchen wall where Frost had practiced delicate ferns upon brick and returned each tool to companionship. The hatchet took its place not as threat, but as counterweight, a steadying square for thoughts tempted by the slope of anger. The ladle, dried and cooled, returned to its peg as a truing stick for thirst and hunger alike. The muslin, wrung and smoothed, remembered it was cloth before it was witness, and waited to shade bread when the hour asked. On packed earth by the step, she poured a second measure and watched the ring darken and sink, then hold, a seal impressed without pageantry, legible to any hand trained in work. Behind her, the house kept the manners learned in night school. A latch rose and sat with neither preen nor pout. A hinge turned for use, not applause. A door received the morning as a guest to be tended, not an occasion for speech. Bells from the cathedral walked their iron count along roof lines and ribs impartially. A buoy out in the river returned a smaller salt syllable, neither comfort nor scold, only time. Inside her, names shifted from keen edge to ember. Ruth first, then the elderbacks and the clear-eyed small ones, arranged to warm a day evenly instead of burning it in a moment. She slid the biscuit tin into its discreet berth among faithful companions, a jar that guards seed, a hammer with a nick that tells a story without exaggeration, a box of bent nails reserved for second lives, and rested a palm on the lid as one blesses bread set to cool. The pewter's chill had become a virtue. The night's strictness had poured itself into balance rather than into trophies. Lydia lifted her eyes to the yard where fog had dropped its veil and left the brick candid. The hour fitted. her shoulders like a garment cut by someone who knew her measure. Without proclamation, she turned toward the corridor that would shortly fill with other feet, carrying forward only what belonged to daylight. Tools returned to use, air returned to honesty, and a law kept not by noise, but by exactness. Dawn unstitched itself over Bay Street in threads of pale gold, and wagon rims resumed their sober talk against the cobbles while the river laid a low breath into the slips. The mansion's shutters tested their tongues, and remembering what the night had taught, took their seats without chatter. In the yard a square of white rose on a line to shade loaves later rather than to bless any verdict. Men in city coats came up the brick walk with papers softened by many thumbs, speaking writs in the voice one uses for weather, as if responsibility could be folded and put away with the document. Lydia stood where threshold meets morning, boards holding a remnant cool, and the kitchen door behind her performed no opinion, only the decent act of receiving and releasing. Faces collected at perimeters, not for sport but for witness. A girl at an upper sash watched through the narrow where curtain meets frame, hand resting on the other as if to keep it from flying. A stooped boy pressed his lips to the line of fist and then let the hand fall, newly instructed. An elder in a yard let his chin move the width of a small account that would not be entered and therefore might endure. Bells stepped the hour onto ribs and roofs equally. Out on the river, a buoy gave an iron syllable in another dialect, neither blessing nor threat, only measure. A deputy cleared his throat in hopes of borrowing weight from the air. The weight remained on paper, ink sitting up like a schoolboy. At noon, the courthouse held a plain geometry, window panes casting pale squares upon plank, benches inviting backs without flattery, a rail earning its polish from hands that leaned there more than from any dignity borrowed. Wool and ink kept their smells in order. Dust hung where light set it too. Papers lay with their corners darkened by doubt. Questions put up a fence. Answers chose carefully where the ground would hold, and where to step back lest a wrong word teach error to live long. The bell, arriving without favor, laid stones of time through the hall, and then left, task complete. No great oration unfolded. Language reduced itself to what it could carry without false shine. A clerk who loves a smooth column paused over a blot that would not be prettied, and, for the span of a breath, considered his own pen before he accused the sum. A minister, trimmed the night before by a modest riser, found his tone obedient to lungs rather than to height. A ring of keys at a constable's hip learned discretion and offered no comment. Lydia kept herself as she had kept the lamp wick, steady, without parade, letting the room discover what it could, without being led by the nose. When the speaking finished, benches released air together in a single human sound, not cheer, not hiss, only the gravity of breath restored to use. On the portico, columns cast careful bones of shade along the steps. Cool rose from stone and received souls that had earned it. Dust braided under a passing wheel and fell apart without memory. Shop doors resumed their ordinary arithmetic of need and coin. A child reached for a gate and smiled at its improved hush. Lydia carried the hour the way one carries a faithful tool, useful, unexhibited. Behind her, pages and columns drew themselves up to old postures as if starch could make them law. Before her, a solitary bell syllable went seeking rest, and found it in those who had watched with their whole bones, where remembrance holds what paper cannot. Late light slanted into the holding room and made a pale ladder against the lime wash, then thought better of climbing, and lay down again, leaving wall and air untroubled. The bench offered its steady length without choosing between those who came. The floorboards showed their grain like honest lines in a palm. The corridor beyond breathed tidily, leather easing at a seam, a key turning no further than duty requires, a latch accepting its place without clearing its throat. The day's noise had gone elsewhere. What lingered was the iron taste a long hour leaves at the back of the tongue, and the mild ghost of soap from a pail set to dry. Within the ribs, names arranged themselves as if pews had been laid in order. Ruth foremost, then elder shoulders that make roofing possible, then the small ones who already discern the temper of a threshold, and breath kept their sequence more faithfully than voice could. Paper so proud that it imagined itself a verdict, loosened in thought until leaf and pulp stood where decree had tried to stand. Bells descended from pageant back to counting the true wages of labor and rest. Doors were relieved of costume and returned to their proper office of receiving and releasing without opinion. White, too, corrected itself. Not glove as emblem, nor spread as absolution, but shirts catching the day's wind on a line, aprons sheltering bread from air, a narrow strip tied under a child's chin when the harbor breath cools too fast. Lydia lifted her eyes to the high, narrow slit and found a ribbon of sky like skimmed milk, a twig whirring its green against iron, and a slice of road exactly wide enough for one honest footfall. Where light crossed the bar, a suggestion of a rung appeared, and then, having thought better of its pretension, withdrew. She leaned forward until her shoulders made a small porch for the room's temperate air. Even a used body, taught by iron and fire, can become a threshold without changing its name. Down the corridor, a door declined to cough in silence, pleased. Let that refusal be the last, best courtesy of the hour. Her hands, cooling from the old red of cord to the brown of remembered work, rested one upon the other, cupped as if for water offered to a friend. No speech pressed at her teeth. The lesson had been made, and would outlast the time allowed to argue it. The bell somewhere far off placed another modest coin upon the day, and walked on. White, reclaimed, waited for tasks worthy of it. Cloth and paper had learned the difference between symbol and service, and doors had remembered their humility. In that corrected quiet, the room took its right size back, and Lydia let the light's last inch go without asking it to mean more than it did, keeping strength for the path that would carry remembrance forward by plainer instruments than any page. Evening loosened its braid over the squares, the live oaks combing dusk into their beards of moss while the river moved with a patience that belonged to older laws. Porch rails took elbows without asking names, and stoops remembered shoes by weight, not by worth. Behind kitchens and along yard fences, the tail made its circuit like beans taught to climb, touch, lean, hold, rise, passing from mouth to mouth until even shutters, once fond of chatter, sat still to listen. It did not march, it kept cadence, and because it kept cadence, it endured beyond any page. They spoke of the pewter ladle, not as bite, but as balance, a leveling weight that steadied temper as it steadies broth. They recalled the house books, not for posture, but for the plant-sweet breath they gave when warmed into humility, paper turning pupil under a gentler air. White cloth stepped down from emblem to shelter, shirts meeting the wind on a line, aprons shading bread, curtains taming harsh light so sleep could find its way. Bells shed parade and returned to honest arithmetic, gather and let go, labor and rest, while doors earned praise for clean passage, hinges learning the smaller music that spares the ear. Names were planted in children's mouths like seed, and weeks later green syllables stood up of their own will. In a borrowed schoolroom, a girl chalked her mother's name twice upon slate so the board would be obliged to keep it. At a stoop, a boy swung a latch to hear the improved hush and smiled because Wood remembered. A dulled bowl caught rain for early greens, and supper leaned toward sense instead of show. Quilts pieced from stark and bright squares warmed the night without sermon, the joining stitches proving how patience binds what pride would scatter. The account did not turn its face from grief to flatter comfort. Sorrow was given a chair under a pecan where shade keeps watch, and no one pried it up before it was ready to stand. The noon verdict occupied only its appointed size, The verdict, carried in kitchens, yards, and lanes, held longer because it lived in backs and wrists, in the quiet economies of setting right what can be set right. On some nights the telling said paper remembered it was plant, on others that a stair trimmed a voice, most often that a table learned to carry truth from underneath its own bright cloth. Weather shifted, the measure held. When dark thickened and the hum thinned, flour was brushed from aprons, caps were set by, and shutters, reformed, closed without display. The story had returned tools to life's side and set pride outdoors. Be part of this keeping. Set your name among us by subscribing to our circle. Lend a small light with your like, share the account so another name may be carried cleanly, and speak your thought in plain words. For the line gathered tonight is simple and durable. Choose steady fairness over loud display.